There is nothing more fraudulent than the modern wedding. It is a carnival of narcissism built on overpriced hydrangeas and the pathetic lie that debt equals devotion. I am Brandi Gray, and usually I profit from that delusion. But when my parents, the same hypocrites who skipped my graduation because the flight was $50 too high, demanded I plan my spoiled sister's wedding for free, something inside me snapped. They wanted a family discount. Fine. I decided to give them a masterclass in malicious compliance that would cost them their dignity instead of their dollars. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The silence before the storm is always the loudest. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a ballroom 10 seconds before the doors open. It is the silence of held breath, of 300 servers freezing in place of crystal stemware, catching the light just so. I lived for that silence. From my vantage point on the mezzanine of the Pierre Hotel, I adjusted my headset and surveyed the scene below. The Midsummer Night's Charity Gala was my masterpiece. 10,000 white hydrangeas, a string quartet, playing a Bridgerton-style cover of a Beatles song, and enough champagne to float a battleship. This was what I did. I was Brandi Gray, owner of Gray & Gold Events, and in this city, if you didn't hire me, your party was just a meeting with snacks. Lighting cue in 3, 2, 1, I whispered into the mic. Below, the chandeliers dimmed to a warm candlelit glow. Perfection. I allowed myself exactly 3 seconds of satisfaction before my personal phone buzzed against my hip. I ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Professionalism dictates that one never takes a personal call during an event, but the persistent vibration suggested an emergency. I stepped into the hallway, smoothing the lapel of my black blazer, and glanced at the screen. It wasn't the hospital. It wasn't the fire department, it was Tiffany. My younger sister did not call to ask how my business was doing. She did not call to ask about the magazine cover I had landed last week, or the fact that I had just secured the mayor's re-election party. Tiffany called for Tiffany. I slid my finger across the screen. Brandi, you'll never guess. Her voice was a high-pitched squeal that could crack glass. He did it. Hunter finally did it. I leaned against the cool plaster wall, closing my eyes for a brief moment. Hunter was her boyfriend of 6 months, a sweet, soft-spoken man from a family whose money was so old it probably came over on the Mayflower. He proposed, I asked, feigning surprise. Yes, look at the ring. Oh wait, you can't see it. I'm FaceTiming you. Answer the video. I declined the video request. I'm working, Tiff. Remember the gala? There was a pause, a huff of breath that I could practically feel through the phone line. Write your party thing. Well, wrap it up. We're coming over for dinner on Sunday. Mom and Dad want to celebrate, and Brandi, bring your planner, the big one. Sunday dinner at my parents' house was an exercise in nostalgia and frugality. The house smelled the same as it had for 30 years: lemon pledge and boiled pot roast. My parents, Linda and Bob, were good people in the way that people who never get parking tickets are good people. They were law-abiding, punctual, and cheap. Not thrifty, not budget-conscious, cheap. They were the kind of people who washed out Ziploc bags until the plastic disintegrated and considered 2-ply toilet paper an unnecessary luxury. I sat at the dining table watching my father meticulously slice the pot roast into paper-thin rations. So, my mother beamed, clasping her hands together. Our little girl is getting married to a Vanderhoot. Tiffany sat next to Hunter, holding her hand out so the diamond caught the light of the single energy-saving bulb overhead. It's going to be the wedding of the century, Tiffany announced, looking directly at me. And naturally, since my big sister is the best planner in the city, I expect the VIP treatment. I took a sip of water, tap naturally, since bottled water was a scam invented by the French, according to Dad. I'd be happy to help you get organized, Tiff, I said carefully. My consultation fee is usually $500, but for family, I'll waive the initial meeting cost. The table went silent. You would have thought I'd asked for a kidney. Tiffany dropped her fork. Fee, she gasped. Brandi, I'm your sister. My father cleared his throat, a sound like a rusty hinge. Now, Brandi, he started, pointing a fork at me. We all know how well you're doing. Fancy office downtown driving that German car. Surely you can do this one thing for the family. We're paying for the wedding, of course, but we expect you to handle the labor. I looked at them. I looked at Tiffany, waiting for her to offer to pay, but she was busy admiring her reflection in a spoon. You want me to plan the entire wedding for free? I clarified. Full service vendor management design day of coordination. It's a gift, Mom said brightly. Consider it your wedding present. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, a cold pressure building behind my ribs. It wasn't just the entitlement, it was the history. I looked at my parents, really looked at them. I saw the people who had claimed they couldn't afford the flight to my college graduation 3 years ago. I had been valedictorian. I had given the speech. I stood on that stage looking out into a sea of proud parents filming on their phones searching for two faces that weren't there. Later I found out why. The airline prices had spiked by $50 a ticket the week before. $50. My crowning achievement, the culmination of 4 years of sleepless nights and scholarships, wasn't worth an extra $100 to them. They had sent a card with a $20 check and a note. Gas is expensive, honey. We're with you in spirit. I had never forgotten the feeling of walking off that stage alone. We have a budget, of course, Dad said, pulling a folded piece of notebook paper from his shirt pocket. We've done the math. We're willing to put up $5,000. Tiffany choked on her water. 5,000, Daddy, the flowers alone will be 10. Nonsense. Dad waved a hand. You have Brandi. She knows the tricks. She can make it happen. Tiffany turned to me, her eyes wide and pleading. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through Pinterest. I want the botanical gardens, Brandi. I want imported orchids. I want a filet mignon station. I want a string quartet like you had at that gala. She looked at me with the expectation of a princess who had never been told no. You'll make it work, right? You'll fix it. Mom and Dad just don't get prices these days, but you can just handle it. She meant I should pay the difference. She meant I should use my connections, call in favors, and likely dip into my own pocket to give her a $50,000 wedding on a $5,000 budget, covering the gap to save our parents from opening their wallets. She wanted me to subsidize their cheapness and her vanity. I looked at Hunter, who was trying to make himself invisible. I looked at my parents, who were already arguing about whether they really needed to serve coffee and tea. And then something snapped. But it didn't snap loud. It snapped quiet. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I realized I had the power here. They wanted me to plan the wedding fine. They wanted me to stick to the budget absolutely. You're right, I said, my voice smooth as silk. I opened my leather-bound notebook. I will do it. I will plan everything. And I promise you, Mom and Dad, I will respect your budget down to the last penny. I won't let you spend a dime more than you're comfortable with. Tiffany clapped her hands. See, I told you she'd do it. I want the theme to be Royal Garden Elegance. My mother sighed in relief. Oh, good. No extravagance. Just a nice, sensible family gathering. I looked at my father. Dad, you have my word. I will plan this wedding strictly according to your tastes and your financial comfort zone. Tiffany heard, I will give you your dream wedding. My parents heard, I will save you money. But I knew what I had actually said. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. And God help them, they were going to get it. Let's get started, I said, uncapping my pen. First item, the venue. The art of wedding planning is 90% psychology and 10% logistics, but the art of revenge planning, that is entirely about documentation. On Monday morning, I arrived at my office, a sun-drenched loft with exposed brick and cream-colored velvet sofas, and created the instruments of my retribution. I made 2 binders. The first was white leather embossed with gold lettering that read, Tiffany and Hunter, A Fairy Tale Beginning. This was the decoy binder. It was filled with pictures of Swarovski crystal chandeliers, 5-tier fondant cakes, and floral arches that cost more than a Honda Civic. This was the binder I would show Tiffany. The second binder was a generic floppy gray plastic folder I had fished out of a supply closet, the kind that pinched your fingers when you tried to close the rings. This was the real binder. I labeled it the parents' budget. This was the binder that would actually dictate the event. The first skirmish was the venue. Tiffany had her heart set on the Botanical Gardens, a stunning glass conservatory filled with rare orchids and humid air that smelled like money. The rental fee was $4,000 for 4 hours, not including the mandatory insurance or the preferred vendor kickbacks. I took my parents to see it first, knowing exactly what would happen. We stood in the center of the lush fern room, and my father looked at the price sheet as if it were a radioactive isotope. 4,000! He sputtered, his face turning a shade of plum that clashed with the greenery. For a room, we're not buying the building, Brandi, we just want to stand in it. My mother clutched her purse tighter. That's nearly the whole budget, honey. We can't do this. Isn't there somewhere sensible? I thought you might say that. I said, my voice dripping with sympathetic understanding. I do have an alternative. It's much more economical. And it's right in your neighborhood. I drove them to the municipal complex past the police station and the library to the community center, specifically to the basement level adjacent to the public swimming pool. The room was called the Multi-Purpose Annex. It featured linoleum floors that had been buffed to a slippery shine, walls painted a color I could only describe as institutional beige, and a distinct lingering scent of chlorine and floor wax. $50, I said, for residents. And it includes the use of 50 metal folding chairs. My father's eyes lit up. $50? Now that is reasonable. That is smart spending. Selling it to Tiffany required a different vocabulary. When I brought her there an hour later, she stood in the doorway wrinkling her nose. It smells like bleach. It smells like cleanliness, I corrected, steering her inside. Tiff, listen to me. Traditional venues are out. The Botanical Gardens basic. Every girl from your high school gets married there. You want something unique. You want exclusive. I gestured to the low ceiling and the exposed ductwork. This is industrial chic. It's an underground speakeasy vibe. Think New York meatpacking district in the 90s. We lower the lights, we create a mood. It's gritty, it's real, it's avant-garde. Tiffany looked at the metal chairs stacked against the wall. Industrial chic, she repeated, testing the words. Exactly, I said. Hunter's family is used to stuffy ballrooms. This will show them you're cool, you're edgy. She bit her lip, looking around. Well, if you think it's cool, Brandi, you're the expert. I am, I smiled. Trust me. Next came the dress. Tiffany wanted Vera Wang. She wanted silk organza hand-beaded bodices and a train long enough to require its own zip code. My parents wanted to spend $300. I can't buy a veil for $300, Tiffany wailed during a conference call, tears threatening to ruin her spray tan. Don't worry, I soothed. I know a place. It's a private showroom for vintage finds. Very sustainable, very high fashion. The private showroom was second time around a consignment shop on the edge of town that smelled of mothballs and despair. I had scouted it earlier and found the dress. It was a relic from 1988, a satin monstrosity with sleeves the size of decorative pillows and a neckline that involved an aggressive amount of lace. It was white technically, but age had yellowed it to a color resembling old parchment. It's big, Tiffany said, staring at the mannequin. It's architectural, I countered. Shoulder pads are making a huge comeback in Paris. Look at the beadwork on the bodice. You can't get this kind of craftsmanship anymore. I turned to Mom. Look at the price tag. Mom squinted. $45. Oh, Tiffany, look. It's destiny. Tiffany looked at me uncertain. Is it really in style? I put a hand on her shoulder. Tiff, you have the bone structure to pull this off. Anyone can wear a strapless mermaid gown. It takes a true fashion icon to rock a vintage power sleeve. I saw the vanity flare in her eyes. She didn't see an ugly dress anymore. She saw herself on a magazine cover titled Brave Choices. Okay, she whispered. I'll try it on. She looked like a marshmallow that had exploded in a lace factory, but my mother was crying tears of financial joy, so the deal was sealed. The menu was the battlefield where the war would truly be won. Tiffany wanted a sit-down dinner, filet mignon with a red wine reduction truffle, mashed potatoes, and roasted asparagus. Hunter loves steak, she swooned. It has to be steak. I sat down with my parents to crunch the numbers. Steak is $40 a plate, I told them. With 200 guests, that's $8,000, just for the meat. My father looked like he was having a cardiac event. 8,000 for food, they're just going to digest, absolutely not. What happened to the 5,000 total? We're tight, I admitted. If we want to stay on budget, we need to get creative with the catering. We need to go home style. I have a great recipe for tuna noodle casserole, my mother suggested. I paused. I had been planning to suggest a taco bar, or maybe pasta, which are cheap, but generally acceptable. But tuna noodle casserole. That was a weapon of mass destruction. It was wet, it was gray, and it involved potato chips crushed on top. It was perfect. Mom, I said, that is brilliant. It's authentic. It speaks to your family heritage. And it's cheap, Dad added. Canned tuna is on sale at the wholesale club. When I presented the menu to Tiffany, I didn't say casserole. I said deconstructed oceanic pasta bake with a rustic potato crisp garnish. I told her we were leaning into the nostalgia trend. Comfort food is huge right now, I lied. Mini grilled cheeses, tomato soup shooters, and for the main, we're doing a tribute to the family hearth. But Hunter likes steak, she whined. Hunter loves you, I said, and Hunter's family eats steak every day. They'll find this charmingly rustic. It's Americana on a plate. To round out the menu, I suggested ambrosia salad marshmallows and canned fruit in sour cream as a retro fruit mousse. For drinks, we skipped the open bar. Instead, I proposed a signature punch, generic ginger ale and rainbow sherbet. It's a prohibition-style mocktail, I told Tiffany. Very speakeasy. The decor budget was non-existent after we paid for the photographer, my Uncle Jerry, who had a nice camera and a shaky hand but worked for free meals. I needed flowers. Real flowers die. They are fragile and expensive. Plastic, I whispered to myself in the dollar store aisle. I filled a cart with stiff neon pink carnations and plastic ivy that looked like it had been manufactured in a facility that also made toxic waste barrels. They symbolize eternal love, I told my parents as we loaded 20 bags of synthetic blooms into their trunk. Because they literally never decompose. For centerpieces, I refused to rent vases. Instead, I raided my parents' attic. I found stacks of Encyclopedia Britannica from 1992. We'll stack them, I decided. It's literary, intellectual. The house of cards almost collapsed 3 days before the wedding. I was in my office transferring the final vendor lists when Tiffany burst in unannounced. I want to see the invoices, she announced, her face flushed. Hunter's mom asked about the caterer and I realized I didn't know the name. I want to check the menu details. Panic is for amateurs. I felt a surge of adrenaline. If she saw the invoice from Sal's Bulk Diner in Delhi listing 20 trays tuna sludge, it was over. Of course, I said, not moving from my desk. But first you have to try this. I opened a box of high-end gold-dusted macarons I had received as a gift from a corporate client. The pastry chef just dropped these off for a tasting. I need your opinion on the almond-to-sugar ratio. Tiffany's eyes widened. She grabbed a macaron. Oh my God, these are divine. Is this for the dessert table? Ideally, I equivocated. I'm working on a surprise for the sweet table. While she was busy inhaling $50 worth of French pastry, I quickly opened a dummy file on my laptop. I typed up a fake menu, filet de bœuf, pomme de terre, asparagus. I printed it out on heavy cardstock. Here, I said, handing her the paper. The caterer is cuisine de la maison, which literally translated to food of the house or mom's cooking. Tiffany scanned the fancy French words. Oh, thank God. Mrs. Vanderhoot is so particular. This looks fancy. She stuffed another macaron in her mouth. You're the best, Brandi. Seriously, I don't know why I was worried. No need to worry, I said, sliding the real binder, the one with the receipt for 200 cans of tuna, into my drawer. Everything is going exactly according to the plan. As she left crumbs on her chin, I looked at the wall where I kept my calendar. Saturday was circled in red. The trap was set. The venue was a basement. The dress was a disaster. The food was school cafeteria grade. And my parents were thrilled because they had only spent $4,800. They thought they had won the lottery. They had no idea they were about to pay the price for every missed birthday, every skipped graduation, and every moment they had valued their bank account over their daughters. The malice wasn't just in the cheapness, it was in the accuracy. I was giving them the world they claimed to value. I smiled, turning off the lights in my office. Malicious compliance is a dish best served with tuna. Saturday arrived with the sky the color of a fresh bruise threatening rain, but delivering only a humid, sticky heat that made hair frizz instantly. I arrived at the community center at 8:00 a.m. sharp, wearing my standard Event Commander all-black ensemble and a headset that wasn't actually connected to anything, mostly to discourage people from talking to me. My team, which consisted of 2 high school students I had hired for minimum wage, and my Uncle Jerry, was already setting up. The multi-purpose annex was living up to its name. In the daylight, the scuff marks on the linoleum were more pronounced, and the smell of the adjacent public pool was pungent, a chemical assault that burned the nostrils. It smells like hygiene, I told myself, checking the alignment of the metal folding chairs. We had set them up in rows, creating an aisle down the center. For the runner, my father had refused to rent a carpet. Instead, we had purchased 3 canvas painter's drop cloths from the hardware store. They were beige, durable, and if you squinted hard enough and had never seen a wedding before, vaguely resembled a rustic linen path. The guests began to arrive at noon. This was the moment where the tectonic plates of Tiffany's fantasy and my parents' reality would grind together to cause an earthquake. On one side of the parking lot rusted sedans and minivans, pulled in my family cousins from the sticks and neighbors who thought Olive Garden was fine dining. On the other side, a fleet of black town cars and Mercedes SUVs glided silently into the spots reserved for pool staff. It was a visual collision of tax brackets. I stood by the door holding a clipboard welcoming the Vanderhoots. They were a terrifyingly beautiful species. The women wore fascinators and pastel silk. The men wore suits that cost more than the venue rental. They stepped out of their climate-controlled vehicles and were immediately hit by the humidity and the smell of chlorine. I saw noses wrinkle in unison. Then came the matriarch. Mrs. Eleanor Vanderhoot exited a Bentley with the grace of a queen stepping onto a balcony. She was wearing a silver suit that shimmered like moonlight, and her hair was a helmet of white perfection. She looked at the peeling paint on the community center sign. She looked at the teenagers doing cannonballs in the outdoor pool visible through the chain-link fence. Then she looked at me. I didn't flinch. "Welcome, Mrs. Vanderhoot," I said, flashing my most professional smile. "If you'll just follow the signs for the Love Bunker, we're right downstairs." She arched an eyebrow, a gesture that probably terrified board members across the state. "The Love Bunker," she repeated. "It's an ironic juxtaposition," I said smoothly. "Please watch your step. The handrail is a bit loose." The descent into the basement was a procession of confusion. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a low-frequency hum that sounded like a trapped insect. As the guests entered the room, the reaction was palpable. It wasn't gasps of awe. It was the stifled silence of people trying to figure out if this was a joke. The centerpieces were the pièces de résistance. My parents beamed as they pointed them out to the confused Vanderhoots. "Encyclopedias," my dad announced proudly, patting a stack of books topped with a plastic ivy vine. "Knowledge is the foundation of marriage, you know. Plus, we had them in the attic." I saw a woman in a Dior dress poke a plastic carnation with her manicured finger. It wobbled stiffly. "They're durable," she whispered to her husband. The ceremony began with the screech of a boombox. My Uncle Jerry had plugged in his iPod, but the auxiliary cord was faulty, so the opening notes of Pachelbel's canon were accompanied by a rhythmic static crunch. The double doors swung open, or rather one swung open, and the other got stuck on the floor mat and Tiffany appeared. The moment she saw the room filled with people, the reality of what she had agreed to hit her. She stopped dead. Her face, professionally contoured and sprayed, went pale. The dress was magnificent in its tragedy. The shoulder pads were so wide she had to turn slightly sideways to navigate the doorframe. The yellowed satin caught the harsh fluorescent light, giving her the appearance of a very expensive stick of butter. She looked at the drop-cloth runner. She looked at the metal chairs. And then, she looked at me. I stood at the front next to the officiant, a notary public my dad knew who charged $20, and I nodded encouragingly. "You wanted this," my eyes said. "You wanted the family discount." She walked. It was a trudge of doom. The skirt of the dress rustled loudly, sounding like crumpling paper with every step. Hunter, bless his heart, grinned like a golden retriever. He didn't care about the drop cloths or the smell of bleach. He just saw Tiffany. It was the only pure thing in the room. As Tiffany reached the altar, her heel caught on a fold of the canvas drop cloth. She stumbled, grabbing the notary's arm to steady herself. "I'm okay," she squeaked, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. My mother wiped a tear. "She looks like a princess," she sniffled. "A thrifty princess." The ceremony was mercifully short, mostly because the notary had a tea time at 2. As soon as they were pronounced husband and wife, the reception began. This simply meant the guests stood up, turned their chairs around to face the folding tables set up at the back of the room, and waited for food. There was no cocktail hour with past hors d'oeuvres. There was the punch bowl. I manned the ladle myself, pouring the frothy swamp green mixture of ginger ale and rainbow sherbet into plastic cups. "It's a vintage mocktail," I told a bewildered cousin of the groom. "Very Prohibition era." He took a sip, grimaced at the sugar rush, and politely set it down on a stack of encyclopedias volume AC. Then came the dinner service. I had hired the staff, the 2 high schoolers, to wear white t-shirts and black jeans. They wheeled out the metal carts. The smell of tuna and heated cream of mushroom soup wafted through the room, battling the chlorine for dominance. Tiffany and Hunter sat at the head table, a card table covered in a white sheet. Tiffany's eyes were darting around the room, waiting for the filet mignon. She still believed deep down that I had pulled a switch, that the cuisine de la maison was real. The first server approached Mrs. Vanderhoot. "Dinner is served," the teenager mumbled, dropping a heavy scoop of grayish-brown casserole onto her paper plate. It made a wet plop sound. A garnish of crushed Lay's potato chips sat sadly on top. Next to it, he placed a scoop of ambrosia salad, neon pink marshmallows glistening in sour cream. The silence in the room was deafening. It was broken only by the sound of my father tucking a napkin into his collar. "Dig in, everyone," he shouted. "It's Linda's famous tuna bake." Mrs. Vanderhoot stared at her plate. She looked at the tuna. She looked at the marshmallows. Then slowly, elegantly, she picked up her plastic fork. Tiffany, however, did not pick up her fork. She stared at the casserole as if it were a pile of radioactive waste. "What is this?" she hissed at me as I walked past to check the water pitchers. "This is the deconstructed oceanic pasta bake," I whispered, leaning in close. "Mom's recipe. Remember we stayed on budget, Tiff. We saved $25,000. Her jaw dropped. You actually did it." Malicious compliance. I didn't say, but the sparkle in my eyes screamed it. Suddenly the music changed. Uncle Jerry had decided that Pachelbel was too sleepy for a party, so he hit shuffle on his party mix. Unfortunately, Uncle Jerry's party mix was exclusively polka hits from the 1970s. "Roll Out the Barrel" blasted through the distorted speakers. My parents, oblivious to the social horror unfolding, jumped up. "Oh, I love this song!" my mom shrieked. She grabbed my dad and they began to polka aggressively in the center of the drop-cloth dance floor. The Vanderhoots watched frozen in anthropological fascination. It was a train wreck. It was a circus. It was exactly what they had paid for. Amidst the accordion music and the smell of warm tuna, the inevitable happened. The coffee percolator, a massive industrial urn my dad had borrowed from his church, was plugged into the same outlet as the boombox and the chaotic string of Christmas lights we had taped to the ceiling. There was a loud pop, a spark, and the side of the room with the food went dark. The music died. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. "Oh, for Pete's sake!" my dad yelled. "Who tripped the breaker?" I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I had anticipated the electrical load of the annex being insufficient. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out a heavy-duty flashlight, and clicked it on. "Maintenance Protocol Alpha," I said to the high schoolers. "Jimmy, go to the utility closet panel B, switch 4. Sarah, unplug the coffee pot and move it to the outlet by the fire exit. I have the extension cord taped to the baseboard already." I moved with the precision of a surgeon. Within 30 seconds, I had guided Sarah to the new outlet, signaled Jimmy, and the lights flickered back on. The music resumed. The crisis was averted before anyone could even complain. I turned around to check the room and found myself nose to nose with Eleanor Vanderhoot. I braced myself. I expected her to scream. I expected her to tell me I was a disgrace to the profession, that I had insulted her family with plastic flowers and tuna sludge. I straightened my blazer, ready to take the hit. But Eleanor wasn't looking at the tuna. She was looking at me. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You knew that breaker would blow," she stated. It wasn't a question. "The amperage in this building is from 1975, I replied calmly. "The coffee urn draws 15 amps. The sound system draws 5. The circuit is rated for 15. It was a mathematical certainty. I had the extension cord ready." Eleanor took a bite of the ambrosia salad. She chewed thoughtfully. "This wedding is a disaster," she said. "It is exactly the wedding my clients, the parents, paid for," I corrected. "To the letter, on time, and under budget." Eleanor looked at Tiffany, who was currently sawing at a plastic flower with a butter knife in a fit of pique. Then she looked at the parents, who were happily eating their casserole. Then she looked back at me. A slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a shark smile. "My last event planner," she said, lowering her voice, "spent $300,000 of my money on a Winter Wonderland gala. The ice sculptures melted before the donors arrived because she didn't account for the heat output of the stage lights. She panicked. She cried in the bathroom." Eleanor took a step closer to me. "You just served tuna casserole to the governor's wife, fixed a blown fuse in 30 seconds without breaking a sweat, and you appear to be the only person in this room who isn't insane." "I take my job seriously," I said. "Even when the job is this." "I can see that," Eleanor murmured. "I have a charity gala coming up, the Heart Foundation. It's a massive undertaking. I need someone who understands logistics, someone who doesn't cry, someone who can manage difficult personalities." She glanced at Tiffany, then back to me. "We should talk, assuming you don't exclusively work in basements." "I go where the budget allows," I said. "Good," she nodded. "Because my budget is significantly higher, but my tolerance for incompetence is 0. She handed me her empty plate. The tuna was cold, but the execution flawless. She walked away, leaving me standing there with a dirty paper plate and a realization. The twist wasn't that I had ruined the wedding. The twist was that by ruining it perfectly, I had auditioned for the biggest job of my life. But the victory lap would have to wait. Across the room, Tiffany stood up. Her face was blotchy, her eyes were wild, and she had a glob of ambrosia salad on her vintage sleeve. The volcano was about to erupt. The tipping point arrived with the toasts, or rather the lack thereof. In a traditional wedding, this is the moment where champagne flows and heartfelt speeches are made. In our basement soiree, my father stood up with a plastic cup of ginger ale sherbet sludge and tapped it with a plastic spoon. The sound was a dull thwack thwack that barely registered over the hum of the pool pumps next door. "To the happy couple," he announced, beaming at the room of stunned millionaires in confusion. "And to staying within means a penny saved is a penny earned." He raised his cup. No one cheered. A few people politely murmured, looking at the neon green liquid with suspicion. That was when Tiffany stood up. She didn't rise gracefully. She shot up like a missile launching from a silo, her chair screeching against the linoleum with a sound so violent it made Uncle Jerry pause the polka music. Her face was a landscape of ruined mascara and blotchy rage. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, and dangerous. She grabbed the microphone from the stand, the feedback screeching through the room like a dying banshee. "Staying within means," she repeated, her voice trembling. She looked at the parents, then she whirled on me. "This isn't about means, this is a joke. Look at this," she screamed, gesturing wildly to the room, her arm sweeping across the vista of metal chairs and drop cloths. "I asked for a wedding and I got a potluck in a dungeon, and you—" She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You did this. You sabotaged me. You're the best planner in the city, and you gave me Tuna. You ruined my life because you're jealous." The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Vanderhoot set down her fork. My mother looked ready to faint. This was the explosion I had anticipated, the moment where the decoy binder fantasy finally died a violent death. It was time for the defense. I didn't scream back. I didn't cry. I walked to the center of the room, my heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor where the drop cloth ended. I carried the gray plastic folder, the real binder, like a shield. I stood next to my sister, who was heaving with sobs, and I turned to face the room. I looked directly at my parents. "Jealousy has nothing to do with it, Tiffany," I said, my voice calm, projected perfectly to the back of the room without the need for a microphone. "I didn't sabotage your wedding. I executed a contract." I opened the binder. The snap of the rings opening echoed in the silence. I pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper, the budget my father had written out. "Mom, Dad," I said, holding up the paper. "You gave me a strict budget of $5,000. You told me verbatim, do not let us spend a penny more than we are comfortable with. You told me that sensible was the priority." I turned to the page with the catering invoice. Filet mignon for 200 people is $8,000. Tuna noodle casserole is $300. I saved you $7,700 on meat alone. I flipped another page. The botanical gardens is $4,000 to rent. The community center annex is $50. I saved you $3,950 on the venue. I looked at my father, who was turning a shade of red that rivaled the marinara sauce we didn't serve. "I gave you exactly what you asked for. I planned the wedding you were willing to pay for." The room was dead silent. My father opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but I wasn't finished. I let the professional mask slip just a fraction, revealing the daughter underneath. "You asked me to respect your budget," I said, my voice softening but carrying a harder edge. "And I did, because I know how important saving money is to you. I remember 3 years ago. I remember standing on a stage waiting for my parents to watch me graduate as valedictorian. And I remember you didn't come, because the flight prices went up by $50. A gasp went through the room. I saw Mrs. Vanderhoot's eyes widen. "You missed the most important day of my life to save $50. So when you told me to stick to the budget for Tiffany's wedding, I took you seriously. I didn't want you to miss this too over a price tag. I made sure you could afford to be here." The truth landed like a physical blow. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up instantly. My father slumped in his chair, the thrifty pride vanishing, replaced by a hollow, crushing realization. They looked at the tuna casserole. They looked at the plastic flowers. And for the first time, they didn't see a bargain. They saw a mirror. They saw exactly how much they had valued their daughters, at the price of a discount venue and canned fish. The shame on their faces was absolute. It was a silence so profound, you could hear the pool filter humming next door. Tiffany stopped crying. She looked at our parents, then at me, the pieces clicking into place. She realized she wasn't the victim of my incompetence. She was the collateral damage of their stinginess. Then a chair scraped. Hunter stood up. The room held its breath, expecting the groom to storm out to demand an annulment to shield his new wife from the humiliation. Hunter looked at the plate of half-eaten casserole in front of him. He looked at Tiffany standing in her yellowed dress in the middle of a basement. He smiled. It wasn't a pity smile. It was genuine. "You know," he said, breaking the tension with a casual shrug. "My cousin's wedding cost $500,000. They're still paying it off and they got divorced last month." He picked up his fork and took a bite of the casserole. "This tuna thing, it's actually really good. It tastes like home." He walked over to Tiffany and took her hand. "Tiff, look at it this way. We have zero debt. We have a story no one will ever forget. And honestly, I'd rather eat casserole with you in a basement than filet mignon with anyone else." Tiffany looked at him stunned. The vanity melted away, replaced by something softer. She squeezed his hand. A few of the Vanderhoot cousins started clapping slowly at first, then louder. Someone yelled, "Hear, hear to no debt." The tension broke. The disaster had been transmuted into something bizarrely heartwarming. My parents, however, didn't cheer. They sat still, staring at the table, the weight of the lesson pressing down on them. I stepped away from the spotlight, feeling the adrenaline crash. I needed air. I needed to get away from the smell of chlorine and regret. I started toward the exit, intending to slip out and let them process the fallout. A hand caught my elbow. I turned to find Mrs. Eleanor Vanderhoot blocking my path. She wasn't clapping. She was holding a business card. "That," she said, her voice low and steely, "was the most effective management of a crisis I have ever witnessed. You dismantled them with a spreadsheet." "I just did my job," I said, feeling tired. "Precisely," she said. "You listened to the client's constraints, however ridiculous, and you executed. You have a spine, Brandi. I like spines. Most planners I hire are terrified of me. You just terrified a roomful of people with a binder." She pressed the card into my hand. "The Heart Foundation Gala. It's in 3 months. The budget is 6 figures. The board is a nightmare. I want you to run it." I looked at the card. It was heavy stock embossed. It was the kind of job that changed careers. "You want to hire me?" I asked. "After this?" I gestured to the drop cloths. "Because of this," she corrected. "Anyone can spend money. It takes a genius to make a point." She glanced at my parents, who were now holding hands, looking miserable. "They learned their lesson. Now come work for someone who can actually afford you." She walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway of the annex. I had my revenge. I had my job offer. But looking at my parents huddled together in the harsh fluorescent light, I realized the hardest part was yet to come, the forgiveness. The morning after the casserole wedding, the sun shone with an audacious brightness that felt entirely unearned. I sat in my office, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, waking up on a Sunday. On my desk lay the 2 binders. I picked up the white leather one, Tiffany and Hunter, A Fairy Tale Beginning, and dropped it into the recycling bin. It landed with a heavy thud. Then I picked up the gray plastic folder, the one that had orchestrated the chaos, and filed it away in a cabinet marked Completed Projects. It was over. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the planning and the execution had faded, leaving behind a strange hollow calm. I wasn't sure if I felt triumphant or just exhausted. I poured myself a coffee black and stared out the window, wondering if my family would ever speak to me again. I didn't have to wonder long. At 10 o'clock sharp, the bell above my office door chimed. I swiveled my chair around, bracing myself for round 2. I expected screaming. I expected my father to be waving a calculator, demanding a refund on the tuna. But when the door opened, there was no shouting. My parents, Linda and Bob, walked in first. They looked smaller than they had yesterday. My mother was wearing sunglasses, likely hiding puffy eyes, and my father was holding a bakery box, looking at the floor, as if the carpet patterns were fascinating. Behind them trailed Tiffany and Hunter. Tiffany was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She didn't look like a bridezilla anymore. She looked like my little sister. Hunter, annoyingly cheerful as always, gave me a wave. "Morning, boss," he chirped. They stood in the middle of my sleek modern office like misplaced furniture. My father cleared his throat, the sound distinct in the silence. He placed the bakery box on my desk. "Donuts," he said gruffly. "The fancy kind. With the sprinkles." It was a peace offering. My father didn't buy fancy donuts. He bought the day-old bag from the grocery store. I looked at the box, then at him. "Thanks, Dad," I said cautiously. "Please sit down." They took the velvet chairs opposite my desk, sitting on the edge of the cushions. The silence stretched elastic and uncomfortable until my mother finally broke it. She took off her sunglasses, revealing red-rimmed eyes. "We owe you an apology," she said, her voice wavering. She reached out and squeezed my father's hand. "We talked all night, Brandi. After we left the basement. We talked about yesterday, and we talked about 3 years ago." She took a breath. "When you brought up your graduation, it was like a slap in the face, a necessary one. We convinced ourselves that saving that $50 on the flight was just being sensible. We told ourselves you wouldn't mind that you knew we loved you." She looked at me, tears spilling over. "But we were wrong. We valued our wallet over your moment. And we did it again with Tiffany. We were so obsessed with getting a deal that we humiliated our daughters." My father nodded, his jaw tight. "I've been a cheap old man," he admitted, his voice rough. "I thought I was being smart, protecting the nest egg. But yesterday, seeing Tiffany trip on that drop cloth, seeing you stand there and defend us with that budget." He shook his head. "I felt about 2 inches tall. You did exactly what we asked, and it was terrible. That's on us, not you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "I want to pay you, your full rate. And I want to reimburse Tiffany for a proper reception, maybe a dinner somewhere nice to make up for it." I looked at the checkbook. It would be a nice chunk of change, but I shook my head, pushing the checkbook gently back toward him. "Put it away, Dad," I said softly. "I don't want the money. The wedding was a gift, in its own way." I looked at Tiffany. "And I think the lesson was worth more than the fee." Tiffany let out a short, dry laugh. "You can say that again," she said. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I was a nightmare, Brandi. I know that. I was so focused on the look of the wedding, I forgot about the actual marriage. I treated you like a servant." She glanced at Hunter, who was happily eating a donut. "But you know what Hunter thought the polka music was hilarious. And he's right. It was memorable. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner. And I'm sorry I didn't stand up for myself." "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. The anger that had been simmering in my chest for 3 years finally evaporated. "We're good." "So," Hunter mumbled through a mouthful of glaze, "does this mean we can do it again? Because I actually like the tuna. But maybe next time better fuses." We all laughed. It was a tentative sound, but it was real. The tension in the room broke. We weren't enemies. We were just a messy, flawed family trying to figure out the balance between love and logistics. "There is one more thing," I said, opening my desk drawer. I pulled out the heavy cream envelope Mrs. Vanderhoot had given me. The wedding wasn't a total loss for business. I slid the contract across the desk. Tiffany picked it up, her eyes widening as she read the letterhead. "The Heart Foundation Gala," she gasped. "Brandi, this is huge. Mrs. Vanderhoot gave this to you. She was impressed by my budget management skills." I smiled. "She hired me on the spot. It's a 6-figure contract, Tiff. It's going to put gray and gold events on the national map." My parents stared at the contract, stunned. My father looked from the paper to me, a new expression on his face, respect. Not the generic parental pride of "good job, honey," but professional respect. He realized that I hadn't just thrown a tantrum, I had leveraged a disaster into a promotion. "You turned lemons into lemonade," he said, shaking his head. "Or tuna into caviar. Something like that, I agreed. I stood up. Now put those donuts away. I'm starving, and I refuse to eat anything that comes out of a can today. Let's go to brunch. Real brunch. We drove to the conservatory, a beautiful bistro with vaulted glass ceilings and an abundance of fresh flowers, ironically similar to the venue Tiffany had originally wanted. We sat at a round table in the sun. We ordered mimosas with real champagne and eggs Benedict. We talked about the wedding, but this time with humor. We laughed about the shoulder pads on the dress. We laughed about the plastic ivy. My mother admitted she had kept one of the centerpieces as a souvenir. It's a reminder, she said, patting my hand, to prioritize people over pennies. When the bill came, the waiter placed the black leather folder in the center of the table. It sat there for a moment, a loaded object. Old habits die hard. I saw my father's hand twitch toward it, then hesitate. He looked at the total, which was likely more than the entire catering budget of the wedding, and I saw the familiar wince in his eyes. He reached for his wallet, his movements slow, resigned to doing the right thing, but painful nonetheless. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his. "Dad," I said. He looked up, surprised. "Stop." I pulled the folder toward me. I pulled out my corporate credit card, the heavy metal one that made a satisfying clink on the table. "I've got it." "Brandi, no," he protested, though weak. "It's too much. Let me—" "I insist," I said, signing the receipt with a flourish. I looked at him, then at Mom, then at Tiffany. I smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached my eyes. "Consider it a thank you for the material, but," I added, raising an eyebrow as I capped my pen, "don't get used to it." They laughed. We walked out of the restaurant and into the bright afternoon sun. The air was clear, the humidity had broken, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like the daughter who had been left behind. I was Brandi Gray. I was a sister, a daughter, and the damn best event planner in the city. And I knew with absolute certainty that my parents would never ever miss another one of my events again. Mostly because they knew I'd probably serve them spam if they did. And that brings us to the end of Brandi's masterpiece of malicious compliance. It serves as a perfect reminder that sometimes the most effective way to teach a lesson is simply to give people exactly what they asked for. If you enjoyed this satisfying tale of family dynamics and frugality, please hit that subscribe button. Let us know below if you would have tried the tuna casserole. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.